Matthew 15, verse 1 to 9, Traditions and Commandments. In Matthew 15, 1 to 9, the narrative opens with a confrontation between Jesus and the religious leaders of Israel. The Pharisees and scribes come from Jerusalem and question him, saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." This question reveals the heart of the dispute, the conflict between inherited religious tradition and the authority of God's word. The washing mentioned here was not a matter of hygiene, but a ceremonial practice developed within the traditions of the elders. Over time, these traditions had become elevated to a level of authority equal to, or even surpassing, the written law. The religious leaders viewed these customs as a defining mark of covenant faithfulness. When they saw the disciples disregard them, they interpreted it as a violation of righteousness. Jesus responds by exposing the deeper issue. Rather than defending the disciples' actions directly, he asks, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition?" With this response, he turns the accusation back upon the accusers. The real problem was not that the disciples ignored tradition, but that the religious leaders had elevated tradition to the point that it nullified the commandment of God. He then gives a specific example. The law commanded, "Honor your father and mother," and also declared severe consequences for dishonoring them. Yet, the leaders had developed a practice, often referred to as korban, in which a person could dedicate possessions to God and thereby claim exemption from supporting their parents. In practice, this tradition allowed individuals to appear devout while neglecting the clear command of the law. Jesus summarizes the result. "Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition." The authority of God's word had been replaced by a human system. What was originally intended as guidance had become a barrier between the people and the true intent of the covenant. At this point, Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah. "These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." This prophecy had originally addressed Israel's condition centuries earlier, but Jesus shows that the same pattern persisted in his own generation. The quotation from Isaiah reveals that the issue was not merely external practice, but the condition of the heart within the covenant community. Outward devotion had replaced inward sincerity. Worship continued in form, but it had become empty because it was grounded in human regulation rather than divine truth. This moment in Matthew's gospel highlights the growing tension between Jesus and the leadership of Israel during the final period of the Old Covenant order. The religious system had become heavily structured around traditions that governed daily life. These traditions functioned as a framework for maintaining identity and authority within the covenant nation. However, the ministry of Jesus consistently exposed the inadequacy of that system. The law itself was never intended to be overshadowed by human interpretation. Yet over generations, layers of tradition had accumulated, obscuring the original purpose of God's commandments. By confronting the Pharisees in this way, Jesus reveals that the problem was not simply misinterpretation, but the replacement of God's authority with human authority. The leaders claimed to defend righteousness, yet their system allowed the clear command of God to be bypassed. Within the broader narrative of Matthew, this passage contributes to the unfolding revelation that the covenant structure centered in the temple and governed by these leaders was approaching its conclusion. The repeated clashes between Jesus and the religious authorities demonstrate that the existing order had reached a state of spiritual corruption that would soon be judged. Thus, Matthew 15, verse 1 to 9 serves as both an exposure of hypocrisy and a declaration that external religious systems cannot substitute for the true authority of God's word. The traditions that once appeared to safeguard devotion had ultimately obscured it, leaving a form of worship that was outwardly impressive but inwardly empty. Jesus' words therefore stand as a decisive critique of a religious framework that had come to rely upon human tradition rather than the living commandment of God. In doing so, he reveals the contrast between a system sustained by inherited regulations and the reality of divine truth that he himself embodies.